You know, usually when you walk down a modern city street, there's this deeply ingrained expectation of, like, permanence.
Right.
You look down at the concrete pavement, you see the iron subway grates, you feel the electrical grids humming under your feet, and you just naturally assume, this is the modern world, this is the bedrock of reality.
Oh, absolutely. It
Right.
feels incredibly solid. It's binary, right? There's the surface we live on, and there's the dirt beneath it.
Exactly.
And we really like to assume that history is something safely tucked away in museums, behind glass, or just pressed into the pages of textbooks. We definitely don't like to think of history as something actively lurking under the soles of our shoes.
No, we really don't. But then you step into the center of Mexico City, and if you know what you're looking at, suddenly that concrete pavement feels, well, paper thin.
Yeah, it really does.
You realize you are standing in an urban landscape that is sitting directly on top of a buried, bloody, and entirely foreign universe.
Literally right underneath you.
Right. The past isn't gone. It's literally just a few feet below the surface. And we have the sources to prove it, We've got encyclopedia entries, historical biographies, and all this incredible visual evidence from 16th century Aztec codices, specifically the Tovar Codex and the Codex Mendoza.
Some of the most fascinating documents we have.
And so our mission for you on this deep dive today is to dig through that concrete. We are going to strip away the centuries of colonial myths, the Spanish propaganda, and frankly, all that Hollywood sensationalism to uncover the actual functioning reality of the Aztec Empire.
Which is so much stranger and more complex than people think.
So much stranger. We're talking about a civilization that ruled millions, built a staggeringly complex cosmological machine, and then just collapsed in a matter of months.
It is a historical trajectory that completely defies simple categorization. I mean, it's so incredibly easy to look at the Aztecs through a modern lens of pure sensationalism,
Oh, for sure. You hear human sacrifice and you just...
Right, the modern mind immediately recoils. You jump to these cartoonish, monstrous caricatures of, like, bloodthirsty villains. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to fundamentally restructure how we view their reality.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I know it's a huge shift in perspective.
It is. So the Aztecs viewed themselves as the chosen people, but not in a privileged, luxurious sense. They believed they were the designated caretakers of the universe.
Wait, caretakers? Like it was a burden?
A massive burden. They were responsible for literally keeping the sun moving across the sky. Every single act of state architecture, every military campaign, every diplomatic marriage, and yes, every human sacrifice was this desperate, highly organized, and logically consistent attempt to prevent the absolute end of the world.
Man, that is heavy. Just waking up every day thinking, if I don't do my job, the universe ends.
Exactly. It's a completely different psychological baseline.
Okay, so to really grasp the mechanics of an empire that operates on that kind of cosmic anxiety, we need a clear roadmap for you listening. We're going to start with the physical heart of the empire, the very center of their universe, and how they essentially, hacked their own history to build it.
A total rewrite.
Yeah. Then we will explore the cosmic mechanics of their society, the literal ledgers of blood and how they fueled their world. From there, we'll examine the terrifying intersection of gender, agriculture, and war in one highly specific, deeply unsettling festival.
Which is just mind-blowing to study.
It really is. Then we'll trace the life of their most famous and probably most misunderstood ruler, Montezuma II. And finally, we will watch as this entire carefully balanced, rigidly centralized system collides with a completely alien force that it had absolutely no theological framework to process.
It is a remarkable, devastating arc. And, to understand the fragility of where they ended up, we really have to look at the sheer audacity of how they started, or I guess more accurately, how they forced a completely new beginning upon themselves.
Right, because if you are looking at the timeline of Mesoamerica, the Aztec Empire, as this dominant monolithic force, didn't slowly evolve over thousands of years like, say, ancient Egypt.
Right, or the dynastic cycles of China.
Exactly. They were relative latecomers to the Valley of Mexico. In the early 1400s, they were just the Mexico one of many competing, relatively scrappy city-states surrounding Lake Texcoco.
They were essentially mercenaries.
Just hired swords, basically. But then this figure named Tlacaelel comes into the historical record. He was an advisor, kind of a prime minister, a shadow emperor who operated alongside the official rulers like its Kotal, and Tlaxcala essentially hits the reset button on their entire civilization.
He orchestrated what is arguably one of the most audacious and successful cultural rewrites in human history. I mean, the sources tell us that under this new regime, Tlaxcala and the ruling elite made a conscious, state-sponsored decision to gather up the old Nahuatl records.
The painted codices, the historical genealogy.
All of it. And they burned them. They
Yeah.
systematically destroyed their own recorded history.
If you're listening to this and thinking, this sounds like a cartoonish supervillain plot, just burning the history books to invent a new religion, you have to realize the sheer logistical power of what he did. Tlaxcala didn't have the internet to contend with, right?
No backups, no digital archives.
Exactly.
Right.
He controlled the oral history, he controlled the scribes. By burning the codices, he essentially created a year zero. He deleted the archive so he could brainwash an entire civilization into a new, heavily weaponized narrative.
And the narrative was brilliant, functionally speaking. He rewrote their origin story to elevate Huitzilopochtli, who was their specific tribal god of war, and the sun to the absolute top of the cosmic hierarchy.
Because before that, he wasn't really a big deal.
Right. Before Tlaxcala's reforms, Huitzilopochtli was a relatively minor deity in the broader Mesoamerican pantheon. But Tlaxcala and the Emperor Itzcoatl recognized that to build an empire, you need a unifying, absolute state ideology.
You need everyone buying into the same exact story.
Precisely. So they engineered this unassailable narrative that the Mexica were not just a tribe of mercenaries who settled in a swamp. They were divinely ordained to conquer the known world to feed the sun. They consolidated legal, military, and religious authority into a single totalitarian framework.
If we stop conquering, the universe plunges into darkness. That is a pretty good motivator for an army.
It's the ultimate motivator. But, to maintain that level of constant existential mobilization, you can't just have an abstract idea. You need a physical anchor.
Yeah.
You need a geographic center of gravity to literally prove your divine mandate.
Which takes us directly into the heart of the capital city, Tenochtitlan, to the Templo Mayor, or the Hui Tecmali. Now, looking at the architectural schematics in our sources, we have to be incredibly clear for the listener. This wasn't just a large building where the priests held weekend ceremonies.
Not at all. The Templo Mayor was the axis mundi. For the Aztecs, it was the literal physical center of the universe.
What?
Yeah, the horizontal plane of the earth and the vertical planes of the heavens and the underworld, they all intersected at this exact geographical coordinate.
So it's basically the fulcrum of reality.
Exactly. Architecturally, the pyramid was designed as a massive stone replica of the Hill of Cotepec, which, according to their newly minted state mythology, was the sacred birthplace of Huitzilopochtli.
Okay, but what's truly fascinating from a sociological perspective is the dual nature of the structure. I mean, it didn't just have one temple on top. It had two shrines at the very summit, accessed by two separate, incredibly steep, parallel staircases.
Right, and that duality is key.
And wait, I need to stop you there because this is where the sources present what looks like a massive contradiction.
Oh, the dedication of the shrines.
Yes. One shrine was dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the blinding, scorching sun. But the other shrine was dedicated to Tlaloc, the ancient, deeply revered Mesoamerican god of rain, storms, and agriculture.
It seems bizarre at first glance.
It totally does. War and agriculture seem like absolute opposites. One destroys populations, burns fields, and consumes resources. The other requires patience, grows crops, and sustains life. So why would a highly organized militaristic society put these two diametrically opposed forces on the exact same pedestal at the literal center of their universe? How does that contradiction actually function?
Well, that is the essential question.
Yep.
And the answer is that to the Aztec mind, they were not contradictions at all. They were deeply symbiotic necessities. It perfectly encapsulates the dual pragmatic needs of an expanding empire.
How so?
So you have Huitzilopochtli representing the dry season, the campaign season. That's the need for blood, for military expansion, and extracting tribute from conquered neighbors. And then you have Tlaloc representing the rainy season, the need for water, the fertility of the soil, and the literal caloric sustenance of the massive urban population of Tenochtitlan.
Ah, I see. Blood and water.
Exactly. War and agriculture. You cannot fund an army without maize, and you cannot secure the lands to grow maize without an army. The two pillars of Aztec survival were sitting side by side, locked in a permanent structural embrace at the center of the world.
And what's wild is that this temple wasn't just built once, consecrated, and left alone. It was a massive, obsessive, ongoing construction project that spanned
It
generations.
never really stopped.
Right. As the empire grew in wealth and territory, the temple physically swelled. The archaeological records show us that the Temple Mare was rebuilt and expanded 6 different times, resulting in 7 distinct, massive stages of construction.
And the way they expanded it is brilliant. They didn't tear the old one down.
Like Russian nesting dolls.
Right. Exactly like that. Instead of tearing the old temple down, each new emperor would build a grander, larger, more imposing pyramid directly over the old one. Think of it like the rings of a tree, where every new layer of stone is a permanent, physical record of an emperor trying to outspend, outconquer, and outglorify his predecessor.
So they just encased the previous versions entirely in stone and earth.
Yep. By the time of the 7th version, which is the one the Spanish conquistadors actually saw in 1519, it was a towering, terrifying behemoth. It measured roughly 328 by 262 feet at its base, and it rose over 200 feet into the sky.
Imagine standing at the base of that. I mean, it was covered in pristine, gleaming white stucco, decorated with brilliant polychrome, paint-deep reds, ochres, bright blues. At the top, massive braziers burned sacred fires day and night, sending thick columns of copal incense smoke into the sky.
It must have been an awe-inspiring, almost crushing sight for any visiting diplomat or conquered chieftain.
It had to be. But here is the part that ties back to our opening thought about the concrete. After the Spanish conquered the city in 1521, they didn't just abandon the Temple Mare, they systematically, ruthlessly dismantled it.
Piece by piece.
Yeah, they used the sacred stones of the pyramid to build their own colonial city directly on top of it, including the massive metropolitan cathedral. The exact location of the center of the Aztec universe was just paved over, forgotten, lost to the friction of time.
Until February 21st, 1978.
Yes. This is one of my favorite moments in modern archaeology. Picture this for a second. You've got a crew of electrical workers from the city's light and power company. They are digging a mundane trench in the middle of a busy street in modern Mexico City.
In an area the locals casually called the Island of the Dogs.
Right, because stray dogs would gather on the slightly higher ground there during heavy rains. So they're just over 2 meters down into the muck and the clay, and one of their shovels hits something solid.
And it doesn't sound like a pipe.
No, it sounds like a massive resonant block of stone. They clear away the mud and they reveal an 8.5-ton, 10-foot wide, perfectly circular stone disc.
And it wasn't just some blank foundation stone. When archaeologists from the National Institute of Anthropology and History arrived and fully cleared it away, they found an incredibly detailed, horrifying relief carving.
Who was on it?
It depicted the goddess Coyolxauhqui. She was the moon goddess, and crucially, she was Huitzilopochtli's sister. Now, to understand why this stone is so important, you have to know the foundational myth of Coatepec.
Right, the new myth that Tlaxcala helped solidify.
Exactly. In that theology, when Huitzilopochtli was still in his mother's womb, his sister Coyolxauhqui and his 400 brothers conspired to murder their mother.
Nice family dynamics.
Yeah, very dramatic. But Huitzilopochtli was born, fully formed, fully armored, wielding a weapon of fire. He defeated his siblings, and he dismembered his sister Coyolxauhqui, casting her broken body down the slopes of the sacred mountain.
And where did these electrical workers find this massive 8.5-ton carving of the dismembered sister? It was sitting precisely at the base of the ruins of the Templo Mayor, exactly at the bottom of the stairs leading up to Huitzilopochtli's shrine.
It's incredible.
The temple itself was the mountain, and the stone at the bottom was the defeated sister. It was a literal, physical, three-dimensional reenactment of their core mythology built into the urban architecture. Finding that single stone was the catalyst for one of the most massive, disruptive urban archaeological excavations in human history.
It changed everything. Under the direction of the brilliant archaeologist Eduardo Matos Moctezuma, the city ended up demolishing 13 modern buildings.
13 buildings?
Yes, 9 from the 1930s, 4 from the 19th century, just tearing up the modern grid to unearth the hidden pyramid beneath. The scale of what Matos Moctezuma and his team discovered is staggering.
What else did they find?
They peeled back the modern city and uncovered over 7,000 intact artifacts just in those initial excavation phases. They found exquisite alabaster carvings, Intricate mixed-text figurines from hundreds of miles away, ceramic urns, obsidian blades, and bizarrely, the meticulously arranged skeletons of crocodiles, frogs, and turtles.
Oh, creatures associated with water, right?
Exactly, offered up at the shrine of Tlaloc.
It fundamentally rewrote our understanding of their reach and their wealth. But here is the unavoidable pivot. If you build a temple that represents the literal center of the universe, and you convince millions of people that the sun will stop moving if that temple isn't maintained, the maintenance costs aren't paid in gold or grain.
No, they are not.
A cosmic engine requires cosmic fuel, and that forces us to look at the ledgers of the Aztec Empire to see exactly how they paid that existential debt.
And that debt, according to the absolute core of their theology, could only be settled with human blood.
Which brings us face to face with the brutal, deeply uncomfortable reality of Aztec human sacrifice. Now, I want to clarify something for you listening. For a very long time in academic circles, there was a fierce historical debate about the scale of this, right?
Oh, a massive debate.
Many modern historians looked at the accounts written by the Spanish conquistadors like Andres de Tapia or Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who described walking into the sacred precinct and seeing the tzompantli.
The skull racks.
Right. These towering, massive racks of tens of thousands of human skulls, and historians dismissed it. They argued logically, oh, that's just colonial exaggeration. It's racist propaganda used after the fact to justify a brutal conquest and the theft of their land.
Which is a very fair historical skepticism to have.
Totally fair. But then in 2015, and again with more discoveries in 2018, archaeologists digging in the side streets near the Templo Mayor hit something horrifying. They found the actual tzompantli.
Yes, the physical, archaeological evidence is now entirely undeniable. They unearthed massive cylindrical towers and elongated wooden racks constructed entirely of human skulls.
We weren't just talking about a loose pile of bones.
No. These skulls were meticulously drilled through the parietal bones, threaded onto heavy wooden poles. And in the towers, they were actually mortared together.
Mortared together with what?
Using a mixture of lime and the actual mandibles, the jawbones of the victims, to create a solid, weight-bearing structure of death.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That is intense.
It is. The Spanish historian Fray Diego de Duran claimed that over 80,000 people were sacrificed just for the 4-day rededication ceremony of the temple under the Emperor Ahuizotl in 1487.
80,000 in 4 days.
Well, most modern demographers and historians agree that 80,000 is logistically impossible and heavily inflated for dramatic effect. But the sheer volume of victims currently being recovered proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that this was a massive, highly bureaucratic, state-sponsored operation.
So let me ask the question that naturally arises from seeing a literal tower of human skulls mortared together. Was this purely a manifestation of extreme religious devotion, or was this, at its core, the ultimate cynical tool for political state terror?
It is a mistake to try and separate the two. To the Aztec ruling class, they were indistinguishable. It was absolutely both. Cosmologically, as we established, the sun god was engaged in a daily, exhausting war against the forces of darkness in the stars. If he lost, the cosmos collapsed.
So they had to feed him.
Yes. The only way to replenish his divine energy was to feed him the most potent, precious substance in the known universe: human hearts and the life force contained in blood. It was a cosmic utility bill that simply had to be paid to keep the lights on.
Right, but politically, you don't build a tower of skulls just for the gods. You build it so other humans can see it.
Exactly. Politically, it was a weapon of mass psychological intimidation. The Aztec Empire wasn't a contiguous, assimilated territory like, say, the Roman Empire. It was a tributary empire. They expanded rapidly in the 15th and 16th centuries, subjugating hundreds of incredibly diverse, sometimes more culturally advanced city-states.
So how do you keep an empire of that size in line when you don't have a massive standing army garrisoned in every single town?
You demand tribute, not just in jade or quetzal feathers or cacao beans, but in human lives. Recent stable isotope DNA testing on the teeth of the victims recovered from the Tzompantli reveals a chilling fact. The vast majority of these skulls belong to outsiders.
Really? Not locals?
No, they were enemy soldiers or enslaved people dragged in from conquered territories hundreds of miles away. The ritual killing, the public display of those specific, identifiable skulls in the center of the capital, was a visceral, inescapable warning to any visiting dignitary or vassal state. This is what happens when you rebel against Tenochtitlan.
But that creates a massive logistical problem. If your entire cosmic and political framework requires a constant, steady stream of thousands of human captives, you need a very specific kind of military. This wasn't about conquering territory, killing the enemy army, and taking their land. This was about essentially farming human beings.
Yes, farming is a very apt way to put it.
And that leads to one of the most bizarre, complex military strategies in recorded history, the Flower Wars, or Xochitl.
The Flower Wars perfectly illustrate how their cosmology completely dictated their battlefield logistics. By the late 15th century, the Aztecs had conquered almost every polity surrounding them, but they intentionally, strategically allowed certain powerful neighboring city-states, most notably the Tlaxcalans to the east, to remain fiercely independent.
Why? Just to have someone to fight.
Not because they couldn't conquer them, but because they needed a designated, reliable sparring partner. They arranged highly formalized ceremonial battles with the Tlaxcalans.
I really want to drill down into the mechanics of this because it challenges everything we think we know about warfare. If you are an Aztec warrior, you do not go into a flower war with the intention of killing the man standing across from you.
No, killing him is a failure.
Right. If you kill him, you have wasted a precious cosmic resource. You went into that battle to capture him alive. An Aztec warrior's entire social mobility, his rank in society, the physical type of cotton clothing he was legally permitted to wear, the jewelry he could display, was entirely rigidly dictated by how many live, struggling captives he could physically drag back to Tenochtitlan.
It was like a grueling, high-stakes system of social currency.
The tactical discipline required to execute that kind of warfare is astounding. Think about the primary Aztec weapon, the macuahuitl.
Oh, it's a terrifying weapon.
It's this heavy wooden club, shaped somewhat like a cricket bat, but the edges are embedded with incredibly sharp, razor-thin obsidian blades. Obsidian can be knapped to an edge sharper than a modern surgical scalpel.
Yeah, if you strike a man with the edge of a macuahuitl, you will sever arteries, shatter bone, and he will bleed out on the battlefield in minutes.
And then you get no credit for him.
Precisely. So the Aztec martial arts training had to be entirely focused on subduing the enemy without lethal force. They had to strike with the flat wooden side of the weapon to concuss the enemy or specifically target non-lethal tendons in the legs to disable them.
That is wild.
They had to fight through the absolute chaos of a melee, overpower a fully armed, desperate Tlaxcalan warrior, bind him, and then march him, alive and relatively healthy, sometimes dozens of miles, back to the capital. The battlefield tactics were completely subverted from slaughter to aggressive kidnapping.
And once those captives were brought back, the rituals surrounding their sacrifice were incredibly intricate. They weren't just lined up and executed. The sources, particularly the visual illustrations and marginalia in the Tovar Codex, give us these terrifyingly detailed step-by-step glimpses into these events.
Yes, like the gladiatorial sacrifices.
Yes, this is something that sounds like it belongs in ancient Rome, but the Mesoamerican version was deeply theological. The Codex shows that a high-ranking enemy captive, someone who had fought bravely, would be paraded through the streets. He was given pulque, an intoxicating fermented agave drink, to numb him. Then he was tied by his ankle to a massive circular carved stone disc called a tamalacatl.
And here's where the agonizing theater of the ritual comes into play. The captive is handed a shield and a macuahuitl, but his weapon is completely neutered.
Right, no obsidian.
Exactly. Instead of razor-sharp obsidian blades, his club is lined with soft bird feathers or occasionally dull wooden pegs. He is then forced to fight one by one against 4 fully armed elite eagle and jaguar warriors wielding real, lethal obsidian weapons.
It's a completely unwinnable scenario designed as a public spectacle of Aztec dominance. The crowd watches him fight until he is inevitably wounded and bleeds out onto the stone, at which point the priests step in.
Let's talk about those priests, the Plamakoski, because the codices provide incredibly vivid descriptions of them. These were not soft, cloistered clerics.
No, they sound terrifying.
They do. The illustrations show these men painted entirely, head to toe, in an ashen, dark blue pigment. Their hair was matted with dried blood from previous rituals, held back tightly by 3 distinct rings. They were the terrifying keepers of the gods. And we must understand, they didn't just inflict violence upon others. They practiced extreme, daily auto-sacrifice upon themselves.
Wow, auto-sacrifice.
Yeah, to prove their devotion and to pay their own minor debts to the gods, these priests would routinely pierce their own tongues, their earlobes, and the fleshy parts of their calves with sharp maguey cactus spines, threading reeds through the wounds to offer their own blood on the altars. Their physical dedication to the cosmic order was absolute.
And we cannot discuss these rituals without addressing the final step in the cycle for many of these captives, which is the practice of ritual cannibalism. The historical sources and archaeological bone analysis explicitly confirm that after the victim's heart was extracted and offered to the sun, the body was thrown down the steep steps of the pyramid.
It was then collected, dismembered, and the flesh was distributed.
The prime cuts, particularly the thighs, were gifted to the specific warrior who had captured the victim, and it was cooked in a stew with maize called clickatlauli, which was consumed by noblemen and elite families.
I want to be very careful here to frame this anthropologically, not sensationally. To the modern palate and modern morality, this is an incredibly abhorrent, deeply disturbing concept. But we have to analyze it within the Aztec context.
Right, it wasn't about food scarcity.
Exactly. This was not a result of starvation. It was not a caloric necessity during a famine. It was a profound act of extreme religious communion. The victim, at the moment of sacrifice, was believed to be physically transformed. They were imbued with the divine spark of the god they were being offered to. Consuming the flesh of that offering was a highly restricted, heavily ritualized way for the Aztec elite to absorb that divine energy. It was considered the ultimate spiritual honor.
It is a staggering worldview to try and step inside, but if we connect all of this to the bigger picture, this incredibly tight, inescapable loop between violence, religion, the military, and the literal sustenance of the people, we see that this wasn't just a macro-political strategy executed by the elites. This cosmic anxiety was woven into the very fabric of daily life, the passing of the Caesars on their calendar, and even their deep-seated views on gender dynamics and fertility.
Which is so crucial to understand.
And there is no better or more deeply unsettling example of how all these elements crash together than the festival of Ocpanistli.
Yes. If you want to truly understand the Aztec psychological landscape, you study Ocpanistli. It perfectly encapsulates a worldview where beauty, the desperate need for agricultural fertility, and the absolute horror of ritual violence are completely, inextricably inseparable.
Here's where it gets really interesting. And again, we are looking at the objective historical facts as recorded in the sources, particularly the deeply researched work of historians like Inga Clendenin. Ocpanistli was the 11th month of the Aztec solar calendar, and the name literally translates to the sweeping of the roads.
It took place in late August or early September, right at the crucial pivot point of the year.
Right, the end of the growing season.
Exactly. The maize was maturing, and they were preparing for the winter rains, and simultaneously the start of the dry season, which meant the start of the warfare and campaigning season.
It was a time of immense transition and vulnerability for the society. The entire city of Tenochtitlan would physically enact this purification. The streets and courtyards would be swept meticulously clean by the citizens, old fires were extinguished, and the entire grueling festival was primarily dedicated to a terrifyingly complex goddess named Tochi, which translates to our grandmother, and her associated deity, Tezcatlipoca.
Now, Tochi was not a warm, nurturing grandmother figure.
No, not at all.
She was the patroness of healing, sweat baths, and midwives, yes, but she was also known as the Woman of Discord. She was a merciless, terrifying goddess of war, earth, and dirt who was believed to devour human flesh.
Why such a terrifying combination of traits for a grandmother goddess?
Because the Aztecs believed that female sexuality and reproductive power was an incredibly potent, wildly unpredictable, and potentially disruptive force in the universe. It brought life, but it was also associated with chaos, filth, and the breakdown of order. Tochi embodied that terrifying duality. She was the raw, untamed power of the earth itself.
To honor Tochi and harness that dangerous energy for the harvest, the priesthood performed a ritual that requires us to really stretch our understanding of human psychology. They selected a specific victim to be the Ixipla.
And the Ixipla wasn't just a sacrifice. She was a living proxy.
Right. The Aztecs believed that through rituals, this chosen young female slave literally became the physical embodiment, the living vessel of the goddess Tochi on earth. For 20 agonizing days before the climax of the festival, this young woman was kept in a state of isolated purity. She was held in a cage, and she was guarded and attended to entirely by older women drawn from the powerful guilds of doctors and midwives.
And the interactions between the Ixipla and these guild women are where the psychological mechanics of the ritual become truly fascinating. These women would clean her, dress her in elaborate finery, and they would engage in boisterous mock battles right in front of her.
Mock battles? With what?
They would divide into teams and pelt each other with balls of Spanish moss, cactus leaves, and bright yellow marigolds. They would tell jokes, laugh loudly, and try to draw her into the levity.
And the sole purpose of those mock battles, this forced merriment, was to keep the girl entertained. They desperately needed to make her smile, or at the very least, remain calm. Because there was one absolute, terrifying, religiously enforced rule for the Igziptla of Tochi. Under no circumstances was she allowed to cry.
The underlying logic here is based on the Aztec belief in sympathetic magic. The idea that the physical actions of a divine proxy directly influence the natural world. If the embodiment of the earth goddess shed a single tear of sorrow or fear, the priests believed it would act as a cosmic trigger for disaster.
Like what kind of disaster?
A tear from Tochi would cause a wave of stillbirths among the pregnant women across the city, or it would doom the warriors to a cowardly, tearful death in the upcoming battle season.
Which is a completely wild contrast to how they treated the rituals for Tlaloc, the rain god. When they sacrificed young children to Tlaloc on the mountain peaks, they actually wanted the children to cry. They would actively pinch them or frighten them to ensure they were weeping as they were sacrificed, because the children's tears were sympathetic magic that would directly pull the rain from the clouds.
Exactly. The magic matched the god. But for the mature, powerful earth goddess, Toshi, absolute smiling stoicism was mandatory.
You try to imagine the psychological pressure cooker that young woman was living in. Historians like Inga Clendenin have written powerfully about the state of sheer repressed hysteria this girl must have been experiencing. She wasn't an idiot. She saw the altar. She knew the calendar. She knew exactly what her ultimate fate was going to be at the end of the 20 days.
Yet, surrounded by these older women, she was forced to maintain a facade of serene, smiling acceptance.
On her final day, they dressed her in a rough Mugway fiber dress that she had woven herself. And as the tension peaked to ensure she didn't break down and cry, the women lied to her. They told her she wasn't going to be killed. They told her that she was being prepared for a great honor, that she was going to have a public, sacred sexual union with the emperor himself at the top of the pyramid.
It is a profound, institutionalized deception. Instead of a royal wedding under the cover of darkness, in absolute eerie silence to prevent any wailing, she is taken to the temple of Toshi. She is suddenly hoisted onto the back of a priest. Her mouth is immediately bound tightly so she cannot scream or cry out, and she is swiftly sacrificed via decapitation.
But her death is not the end of the festival. It is merely the setup for the true, deeply symbolic climax of Akpanitsli.
What's fascinating here is the intense, almost surreal layering of theological symbolism that follows. The moment the girl is dead, her body is flayed. Specialized priests remove her skin in one nearly continuous unbroken piece. And then, a massive, incredibly strong male priest steps forward. He struggles his way into that wet, bloody skin. He literally steps inside her identity.
He physically becomes Tochi. The historical texts note that from that moment on, this towering male priest wearing the flayed skin of a woman is addressed by the crowds and the other priests exclusively as she and her.
Exactly. This priest is now embodying a highly complex, dual-gender deity, a strong, aggressive male presence contained within the skin of the female earth goddess. This terrifying figure then proceeds to a specific location and simulates a sexual union with the war god Huitzilopochtli.
Wow.
The priest, wearing the skin, spreads his legs wide, squats, and then ritually gives birth. But he gives birth to another priest who represents Centautle, the Lord of Maize.
I am pausing here because I know you listening are trying to process the sheer visual and psychological intensity of this. So what does this all actually mean? Why this incredibly specific, horrific, multi-stage sequence of events involving flaying, gender bending, and simulated birth?
It is a precise physical reenactment of the Aztec creation myth regarding the earth itself. In their foundational mythology, the primordial earth monster, Tenochtitlan, had to be violently torn apart by the gods to create the habitable world so that the mountains could form and the plants could grow from her flesh.
So the girl represents the earth monster.
Exactly. The tearing apart of this young woman's body, the flaying of her skin, was seen as an absolutely necessary reenactment of that original violence to ensure a good harvest. Furthermore, the Aztecs viewed maize itself as inherently gender fluid over its life cycle.
Wait, really? The corn itself?
Yes, young, tender green corn with its milky, soft kernels and long silk hair was universally viewed as female. But the mature, dried, hard, erect corn cobs that were harvested in the autumn and used for seed were viewed as male. The male priest in the female skin giving birth to the male maize lord perfectly symbolized that agricultural transformation.
That is incredibly layered.
It tied the chaotic, bloody violence of war and death directly to the fertility of the crops and the literal caloric survival of the Aztec people.
The psychological grip this festival must have had on the populace of Tenochtitlan is staggering to consider. The festival ultimately ends with the elite warriors, the most hardened killers in the empire, staging a massive mock battle where they flee in simulated absolute terror from this priest dressed as Tochi, throwing marigolds at her to appease her.
It perfectly highlights their profound societal fear of this untamed divine female power and the earth itself.
Maintaining this incredibly complex, bloody, and fragile cosmic machine where one misstep in a ritual could supposedly end the world required absolute, unquestioned, iron-fisted leadership. You couldn't have a weak, indecisive ruler when the sun was constantly threatening to go out. It required a man trained from the moment he could walk to be a scholar, a theologian, a general, and a divine killer all at once.
And that incredibly specific resume leads us correctly to Montezuma II.
Yes. Moctezuma Ukuyotsin, which is a name that beautifully and menacingly translates to angry like a lord or he who frowns like a lord. We tend to just anglicize it to Montezuma. He was the ninth and ultimately the final true independent emperor of the Aztec Empire, reigning from 1502 until his tragic end in 1520.
And his life is the ultimate case study in absolute, concentrated, unchecked power. But he wasn't just born into a life of idle luxury and handed the crown on a velvet pillow. He had to survive a system designed to forge living gods.
His upbringing was essentially a decade-long masterclass in pain tolerance, theological memorization, and emotional repression.
Absolutely.
As a young noble, he was sent to the Kalmakak. This wasn't a standard boarding school. It was an elite, brutal religious academy for the sons of the nobility. The sources tell us that Montezuma's daily routine was designed to break the individual ego. It involved waking up hours before dawn in the freezing high-altitude air of the Valley of Mexico.
Don't do manual labor, right?
Yes, he was required to sweep the temple shrines perfectly clean, a seemingly menial task that instilled deep humility. He was forced to bathe in freezing cold mountain water. And crucially, he had to repeatedly, daily, let his own blood.
As a child.
As a young man, yes. He was taught exactly how to pierce his ears, his tongue, and the calves of his legs using sharp agave spines, offering the blood to the gods while enduring the pain in absolute silence. He was being physically and psychologically steeled against suffering.
The physical conditioning was matched only by the theological indoctrination. There's a wonderful, highly specific anecdote recorded in the chronicles about his physical prowess during a major festival called Xochitl, which translates to the Great Fall of the Fruit. As a young man, Montezuma competed against the strongest nobles and commoner warriors alike in a brutal physical challenge.
Was this the pole climbing thing?
Yes. The goal was to race up the side of a massive, towering, greased wooden pole. The first man to reach the top and grab the effigy of the fire god, Xiuhtlacutli, won. Montezuma won the race. He proved his absolute athletic dominance, and the prize for winning was the sacred right to assist the priests in holding down the sacrificial victims on the altar.
Wow, what a prize.
Right. Through these acts, he was rapidly climbing the ranks of both the military hierarchy and the priesthood simultaneously. He was proving he was the perfect embodiment of the Aztec ideal.
He was being primed purposefully to succeed his uncle, the Emperor Ahuitzotl. And we have to give you listening some brief context on Uncle Ahuitzotl because he casts a massive shadow over Montezuma's reign. Ahuitzotl was arguably the greatest, most ruthless conqueror in Aztec history.
A total force of nature.
He was the one who expanded the empire's borders to its absolute zenith, conquering lands all the way down through modern Oaxaca to the Pacific coast and deep into modern Guatemala. He was the emperor who ordered the sacrifice of the tens of thousands at the dedication of the Templo Mayor. But his death, given his terrifying reputation, was incredibly, almost comically bizarre.
It is one of those strange historical ironies. Ahuitzotl, the great conqueror of nations, didn't die in glorious battle. He was deeply concerned about the changing water levels of Lake Texcoco surrounding the island city. He had ordered the massive construction of an aqueduct and a storm barrier to protect Tenochtitlan from unpredictable floods.
Okay, so a public works project.
Right. In 1502, during a particularly massive torrential flood, the waters breached the defenses. Ahuitzotl rushed out of his palace to inspect the barrier and rally the workers. The historical accounts say that in the chaos, the mighty emperor slipped on the wet, slime-covered stones, fell backward, and struck his head heavily on a wooden lintel or a stone doorway.
He just slipped and fell.
Yep. He suffered massive head trauma and died a slow, agonizing death 3 days later in his bed.
A completely anticlimactic, accidental end for a god king. But his sudden death leaves a massive power vacuum, and the Supreme Council of Elders selects his nephew Montezuma to take the throne. But here is where we see how deeply entrenched the theology was. Montezuma doesn't just step over his uncle's body and put on a crown. The sources detail an exhausting, highly perilous four-stage coronation process that was designed to literally strip away his mortality and rebuild him as a living deity.
The first step was separation and retreat. The moment he was chosen, Montezuma was immediately stripped of all his elaborate noble finery. Wearing nothing but a rough, simple maguey fiber loincloth, he walked barefoot across the great plaza to the Templo Mayor, purposefully feigning physical weakness and profound humility.
He went into hiding, right?
He descended the steps into a darkened military house called the Tlacarcoco, the House of Darts, and there he disappeared from the public eye. For 4 days and 4 nights, he sat in absolute isolation, engaging in intense fasting, sleep deprivation, and severe bloodletting. He was symbolically dying to his old human life.
The psychological effect of fasting and bleeding alone in the dark for 4 days would leave anyone in an altered, highly suggestible state of consciousness.
Absolutely. Once he survived that, step 2 was the investiture. He emerges from the dark, physically weakened but spiritually purified. He is led by the high priests to the incredible, terrifying throne carved in the shape of a jaguar and an eagle.
But he isn't allowed to rest yet.
No, he must immediately offer more blood, this time embarking on a grueling procession to various specific shrines, including the Kotiokli, which was a deeply weird temple that functioned as a cosmic prison. It housed the captured, physically bound statues of the gods of foreign nations they had conquered. He even descends into a dark, cave-like temple dedicated to Xipe Totec, the flayed lord, offering his blood directly into the earth.
Then comes step 3, which really highlights the intersection of religion and geopolitics. The Coronation War. An Aztec emperor couldn't just throw a lavish party to celebrate his ascension. He had to unequivocally prove his military might and his ability to feed the sun immediately. Montezuma gathered the army and traveled north to violently conquer the rebellious region of Napala.
He needed to gather fresh, high-ranking enemy captives to fund the massive sacrifices required for his own coronation ceremony. A weak showing in the Coronation War could doom an emperor's reign before it even began.
But Montezuma succeeds. He brings back the captives, which triggers the final step, step 4, confirmation. This is the massive empire-wide feast funded entirely by the royal household's tribute stores. And this is where the Aztec diplomatic arrogance truly shines. Enemies from unconquered hostile territories like the Tenochtitlans were actually sent formal invitations and guaranteed safe passage to attend this feast.
And the crazy thing is, they came.
Right, because if they didn't bring magnificent enough gifts to the new emperor, it was considered a formal insult that would guarantee an invasion. During the absolute height of this feast, the doors of the temple swing open, and Montezuma emerges from thick, rolling clouds of burning copal incense. He is draped in the green feathers of the Quetzal bird, covered in gold. He is no longer considered a mortal man. He is officially the living, breathing image of Huitzilopochtli on Earth.
We often think of ancient kings living in a state of relaxed, ultimate luxury. But when you look closely at Montezuma's life, it seems like an utterly exhausting, paranoid blend of absolute opulence and terrifying, relentless religious obligation.
Which makes me wonder, and I think you listening might be wondering the same thing. Did Montezuma actually have control over his empire? Or was he essentially a prisoner of his own state theology? Was he trapped by the very system he was supposed to rule?
The evidence strongly suggests that Montezuma recognized that danger and actively leaned heavily into centralizing control to protect himself. Once he was fully in power, he enacted a major, controversial dictatorial shift within the government. He systematically purged the court.
Oh, he fired people.
He actually demoted, dismissed, or executed many of the powerful, independent advisors, the men who occupied that cliquial role of the shadow emperor we talked about earlier. He replaced them with younger nobles who were entirely dependent on his personal favor. He centralized all military, economic, and religious authority directly into his own physical person. He made himself an untouchable, unassailable godkin.
And the physical opulence he surrounded himself with to project that power was staggering. The Spanish accounts later detailed his palace complex. He lived in a sprawling compound attended by over 3,000 servants, guards, and concubines. He had a massive private zoo right in the middle of the city, filled with jaguars, pumas, and wolves, which were fed the meat of sacrificial victims.
He even had 10 entire massive rooms dedicated just to an aviary, housing every species of bird in Mesoamerica, with separate pools of fresh and salt water maintained for the aquatic birds.
That is insane. He wore sandals with soles made of solid gold. The rules of his court were absolute. Commoners and even lesser nobles were strictly forbidden to look him in the eye. If they were brought into his presence, they had to remove their rich cloaks, wear coarse magway fiber, cast their eyes downward to the floor, and address him with a series of deeply submissive honorifics.
He had successfully built the ultimate, perfectly centralized system. He had millions of people, hundreds of subjugated vassal states, and a massive bureaucracy, all bowing to this one single divine figure sitting in the center of a lake. But mathematically, structurally, here is the fatal flaw in that exact architectural design. If you centralize all power, all decision-making, and all religious authority into one single person, what happens when a completely unexplainable, highly disruptive outside variable arrives? A variable that absolutely does not fit into your rigid cosmological framework.
You don't have a backup plan. The entire centralized system paralyzes itself.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the collapse, the sudden, violent arrival of the aliens. I want you to imagine for a second being Montezuma. You are the absolute apex predator of your known world. You are a living god. You command armies of hundreds of thousands. And then around the year 1515, strange, deeply unsettling reports start trickling into Tenochtitlan from your spies stationed on the far eastern coast on the edge of the Great Ocean.
They are seeing impossible things.
They draw pictures of floating temples, massive wooden ships with billowing white clouds for sails moving off the shores. They report seeing men with thick hair growing on their faces, wearing clothing made of impenetrable gray stone, which was steel armor. And most terrifyingly, they report these men riding upon the backs of massive, snorting, terrifying, hornless deer, which were, of course, European horses, an animal the Aztecs had never seen.
It was Hernán Cortés and his expedition of Spanish conquistadors making their initial probes and eventually landing in force in 1519. And this exact moment is where Montezuma's hyper-centralized worldview fatally, tragically betrays him.
Right, because if a European king heard reports of a heavily armed foreign force landing on his shores, his immediate instinctual response would be to dispatch an army to crush the beachhead.
Of course. But Montezuma is not operating on European military logic. He is operating on deeply entrenched Aztec theological logic. In Mesoamerican culture, disputes and potential threats from powerful, unknown, potentially divine entities are often tested and appeased first with diplomacy, specifically through massive, overwhelming gifts of wealth.
So instead of sending 50,000 jaguar warriors to push Cortés into the sea, Montezuma sends diplomatic emissaries bearing staggering gifts of beautifully crafted gold and silver artwork.
Which, if you know anything about Spanish conquistadors, is literally the absolute worst possible thing you could do.
It's like throwing buckets of chum into shark-infested waters.
Exactly. It completely fueled their avarice and confirmed their wildest rumors that somewhere inland, hidden behind the mountains, there was an empire possessing unimaginable wealth just waiting to be taken.
It sealed Tenochtitlan's fate. As Cortés begins his march inland, he brilliantly and ruthlessly exploits the political fractures of the empire. He realizes quickly that the Aztecs are not universally loved by their subjects. He encounters the Tlaxcalans, remember them? The fierce, independent people the Aztecs deliberately used for their flower wars.
They've been bled, blockaded, and humiliated by the Aztecs for a century.
Did they see these strange, armored men with their booming gunpowder weapons not as gods, but as the ultimate heaven-sent weapon of revenge? Cortés forms a massive alliance with them. By November 1519, Cortés, backed by a few hundred Spaniards and thousands of heavily armed, highly motivated indigenous allies, reaches the great causeways leading across the lake into Tenochtitlan.
So what does this all mean? We reach this moment of profound, world-altering, tragic irony. Montezuma, commanding an army that could have crushed the Spanish by sheer numbers on the narrow causeways, does not fight them.
He invites Cortés into the city. He formally welcomes the alien force. He houses them in one of his father's grand palaces. He actually gives Cortés a guided tour of the city. He walks him through the bustling, incredibly complex markets of Tlatelolco, and he takes him to the top of the beautiful, terrifying Templo Mayor.
He extends the hand of friendship because his theology, his politics, and his entire lived experience have absolutely no framework for processing an enemy that doesn't play by the established Mesoamerican rules of engagement.
And Cortés, sensing the hesitation and the structural weakness of relying on one man, executes a breathtakingly audacious, incredibly dangerous move within days of arriving. While inside the palace, surrounded by a city of hundreds of thousands of Aztec warriors, Cortés and his captains managed to take Montezuma hostage.
They placed the living god of the empire under armed house arrest within his own capital.
They used threats of immediate violence to force Montezuma to swear formal allegiance to a foreign king he has never met, King Charles V of Spain. Montezuma, trying to buy time, trying to understand the will of the gods, complies. He becomes a mouthpiece, a puppet for the invaders.
The psychological devastation for the Aztec people at that moment must have been absolute. The man they believed was the sun incarnate, the man who couldn't be looked in the eye, is now clearly a terrified prisoner, relaying orders for these dirty, greedy foreigners to strip the temples of gold.
But the tipping point, the singular event that finally shatters the illusion of control and breaks the empire, happens a few months later, in May 1520. Cortés is forced to temporarily leave the capital with a portion of his men to deal with a rival Spanish force that has landed on the coast to arrest him. He leaves a captain named Pedro de Alvarado in charge of the garrison holding Montezuma.
And Pedro de Alvarado was not a diplomat. He was a ruthless, deeply paranoid, and violently impulsive man. While Cortés was away, the Aztec nobility had asked for and received permission to celebrate the major festival of Toxcatl in the sacred precinct of the Templo Mayor.
Right, it was to be a massive, vibrant, sacred dance involving thousands of the absolute highest-ranking Aztec elite, the greatest warriors, the high priests, the brightest young nobles of the empire. Because it was a religious dance, they were entirely unarmed, but they were dressed in their absolute finest regalia. Massive displays of quetzal feathers, intricate turquoise mosaics, and heavy gold jewelry.
Alvarado watches this massive gathering of the Aztec military and political elite, and his paranoia takes over. He later claims he was tipped off to a plot that the Aztecs were going to use the festival as a distraction to attack the Spanish. But what he does next is not a preemptive defense. It is purely a calculated slaughter.
It's horrific.
He waits until the thousands of dancers are completely absorbed in the hypnotic rhythm of the drums and the ritual. Then he orders his heavily armored men to quietly block every single exit of the walled sacred precinct. They draw their Toledo steel swords, lower their halberds, and they just start butchering. They wade into the crowd of unarmed dancers and systematically dismember them on the sacred ground.
The historical sources from both sides are horrifying to read. They describe the blood running in rivers across the plaza. They estimate that between 8,000 and 10,000 of the absolute cream of the Aztec nobility were slaughtered in a matter of hours.
This raises an important question, one that forces us to examine the massive clash of moralities at the heart of this history. Throughout the conquest, and for centuries afterward, the Spanish constantly cited the horror of Aztec human sacrifice as the fundamental moral justification for their brutal actions. They claimed they were bringing the light of civilization and Christianity to bloodthirsty monsters.
Yet their first major decisive act of military control in the capital wasn't a righteous battle. It was a premeditated, cowardly mass slaughter of thousands of unarmed dancers trapped inside a church courtyard. It exposes a profound, undeniable hypocrisy at the core of the conquest narrative.
The massacre at the Great Temple finally ignites the powder keg. The Aztecs, stripped of their leadership but united by absolute rage and griefs, finally snap. The city of 200,000 people erupts into an inferno of violence. They besiege the Spanish garrison inside the palace, cutting off their food and water.
In late June 1520, Cortés, who has managed to fight his way back into the besieged city, realizes they are entirely trapped. In a desperate move, he drags his captive puppet Montezuma out onto the roof or balcony of the palace, demanding that the emperor order his people to stand down and let the Spanish leave peacefully.
And this tragic moment marks the absolute end of Montezuma. The exact details of his final moments are heavily contested by the competing histories.
Right, there are two main versions.
Exactly. The Spanish accounts, written to absolve themselves of murdering a sovereign king, claim that the Aztec populace, completely disillusioned and disgusted by his weakness and perceived treason, pelted him with a barrage of heavy stones and arrows. They claim he was struck in the head by his own people and died of his wounds shortly after, refusing medical treatment.
But the Aztec accounts say something different.
Yes, recorded shortly after the conquest, the Aztec accounts assert that once Cortés realized Montezuma had lost all authority and was no longer useful as a hostage, the Spanish simply quietly stabbed him to death before attempting to flee the palace.
Either way, he dies in absolute disgrace, a captive in his own palace, hated by the people he was born to rule. And the news of his death triggers what the Spanish would come to call the Night of Tears, the Noche Triste. Under the cover of a heavy rainstorm at midnight, the Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies try to sneak out of the city, creeping across the narrow, exposed causeways leading to the mainland.
But they are weighed down. They've spent the last 6 months looting the treasury, and they have stuffed their armor with heavy bars of melted down Aztec gold.
They are spotted by an Aztec woman drawing water. The alarm is sounded, the great drums of the temple are beaten, and the Aztec warriors attack them furiously from thousands of canoes in the dark. Hundreds of Spanish soldiers and thousands of their indigenous allies are killed. Many of the Spaniards simply drown in the deep waters of the lake, pulled straight to the bottom, dragged down by the sheer weight of their own greed.
It was a massive, humiliating, devastating defeat for the Spanish force and a moment of triumphant vengeance for the Aztecs. But as history tells us, it was not the end. The Spanish, driven by the promise of the gold they had seen, would recuperate, rebuild their alliances, and return a year later.
Aided heavily by the invisible, ravaging vanguard of a smallpox epidemic that they had unknowingly introduced.
A disease the Aztecs had zero immunity against. The Spanish would lay a brutal, grinding, months-long siege to the starving city, eventually blockading it and dismantling the empire for good in August of 1521.
It is an incredible, devastating, deeply complex arc of human history. We've traced it all, from Tenochtitlan's audacious, ruthless rewriting of history to build a divine, militarized state from nothing, through the terrifying cosmological machinery of festivals like Okpanisli, where the cycles of crops and blood were unified, all the way to the majestic, paranoid, and ultimately doomed reign of Montezuma II.
And if there is one core insight to take away from synthesizing all these sources, it is that we must discard the simplistic caricatures. The Aztecs were not just the one-dimensional, bloodthirsty monsters of colonial myth. They were a deeply complex, highly organized, profoundly devout civilization bound by a terrifying cosmic duty. They marshaled the resources of millions to build an empire specifically designed to hold the fragile universe together.
But that exact rigidity, that absolute certainty in their own divine center, made them fatally vulnerable to an outside world and outside logic that they simply couldn't comprehend.
It really is a tragedy of incompatible worldviews.
It really changes how you look at the physical ground beneath your feet. Think about the Templo Mayor one last time. It was the beating heart of an empire of millions, the literal center of the universe. It was soaked in blood, covered in gold, and it was completely dismantled. Its sacred stones were used to pave over the pass, buried under a modern city's bustling streets, and totally, literally forgotten for 400 years.
It's just wild to think about.
All it took was a random electrical worker swinging a shovel in the mud in 1978 to bring the gods back to the surface. It forces you to wonder, as you walk down your own street today looking at the solid, comforting concrete, what other massive, world-defining histories are literally buried right beneath our feet right now, just waiting for the dirt to be brushed away?
A great question to end on.
Thank you for joining the deep dive.